like I certainly think what the appropriate protocol is to survive or encounter, with possible rogue and law enforcement. I think about that. But for the most part, I feel like people don't have any sense of what has been won, what has been fought for, and I don't think we should just say just go to the booth and vote. Like there's a way to go to the booth with mobilization and strategy and follow up and follow through. So I don't think we should just tell young people go vote and then that's the end all and be all. But one of the things that come up is like people are starting to say, well, I don't care if people died for all this, so we can vote. They tired of hearing it. But people really have died for my ability to vote. It's hard for me to just be like, the hell with all that. I don't see a way for me to be able to have that kind of position. But to the original point I was going to try to make, as far as what people have asked me what to do, I went to Ferguson probably 2 weeks after everything, so just so I could get a visual, and I basically just took pictures. And I actually couldn't find any organizers on the ground, no local ones. I called all of my networks, like nobody knew anybody that I could get connected with, at least in time enough for me to be able to just break bread with them while I was there. But I've been saying is, like, we've been doing this dance over and over again. We've gone, we rioted, protested, burned stuff up. And I won't play like the political card of like tell my people they shouldn't burn down buildings. And then even more importantly, not offer them a strategy that leads to a solution. I do think we do have strategies that can lead to solutions, but I don't know if people are prepared to do those things because they're not work that comes with, to take it there. It's a little more cathartic to just have that confrontational piece. And that's what I feel. I feel like the only lessons that I've seen learned from Ferguson is just about tear gas, how to survive tear gas and a couple of other things. But it seems to me from Trayvon Martin in 2012, the Zimmerman verdict in 2013, Mike Brown in 2014, Walter Scott 2015, and this last, basically this whole 2020, there's so much and wisdom, and I feel like places like the Modjeska School are like on the few places where you can get a container of tactics that are that have failed, but at least you have this expanse of information. And I'm just in that space. I'm almost 50 now. I'll be 47 this year. So I feel like an elder. I don't know how old I look to young people, but I do feel like an elder, and I'm more in that space of wanting to impart tactics that are going to lead to wins without still discounting people's desire for catharsis. Like, I get it. You feel emotional. You want to have that release, and we coming off a pandemic. But I still think there are other tactical moves that we can be making. And, I'm so curious and fascinated how to have those conversations in a more broad way, other than my one-to-ones. So I just wanted to put that out there and just offer like what I feel the context of history, how it can inform community organizers and mobilizing their troops, and definitely not mobilizing them into harm's way, for sure.
Well, I would say, Omar, that thank you for those fundamental insights. A colleague reminded me of a book written by James Button in 1978, and I'll put this in the chat room, called Black Violence, Political Impact of the 1960s Riots. And part of this is sort of political theory, but political sociology about, in a broad respect, when folks say, well, violence doesn't accomplish anything. Actually, it does. Actually, it does. And within a context, within a certain set of outcomes, it can push a set of policy agendas and at least political structures respond. Now, you are absolutely right to say that if it's not a sort of strategic set of calculations, if they're not movement leaders and organizations, then there'll be some response, but will that response be dispersed? So in some respects, I also say, and this is history, many of you also know that I was talking in my class today about what some refer to as the first SNCC, the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And we've talked about the Southern Negro Youth Congress in this class, and the disconnect between the SNCC 1 and SNCC 2, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that speaks to what some of the theory that Belinda Robnett, that SNCC 2 didn't know about SNCC 1. That all that was organized around one was not known about the others we've discussed in class. And I'll just stop here by saying that there's a theory that Belinda Robnett, as a sociologist, has about, that she refers to as bridge leaders. And some have kind of even extended upon Robnett's bridge leaders. Bridge leaders are those individuals who have essentially political legitimacy with the community in question, although they don't hold any titles, but they bridge the formal movement to the community. Someone like an Ella Baker, whose title did not match what she actually did in terms of connecting people to community. But we also need bridge leaders intergenerationally as well, right? And so there's not a disconnect from one generation to the next, and that the wheel is not recreated, each time on each level. So yeah, just wanted to share that.
Oh, thanks so much from both Amari and Todd sharing those points with us, because a lot of what they've been talking about is really important to not just what we're talking about this evening, but to what the class has been about overall. Now, I don't think any of us expected when the class began several months ago that we'd be dealing with a nation that is, quite frankly, in the middle of multiple crises at one time. But certainly it does highlight the need to think and act as citizens, as activists, from an informed position. So Brett, do you want to take us off from there?
Well, thank you, Robert. Are we ready to begin?
Yes.
Well, good evening, everybody. I do want to mention, following up on the introductory discussions here, that the network did a Zoom, a community forum that when the tear gas started flying. What was that, Tuesday? Tuesday. And it had maybe 40-something people and most of them were members, far-flung members that we don't see all the time. And it was productive. And we've got one scheduled again tomorrow night at 7 that's open for everyone. And there's an email that's gone out to hopefully everybody that is here tonight at Modjeska School is also signed up for the network email. And this is our first of the month email. We send one of the 1st and the 15th. And it speaks to the things that we're talking about now, the things that we teach in the Modjeska School, the things we've been practicing in the Progressive Network for 24 years, and the things that we learned from the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And that there's this continuum that if you're aware of it, you realize that the revolution to change the things that are so painful is not an event. It's a process. It takes a long time. It's not as much drama, and it takes a lot more work than a protest. And so we will be talking tomorrow night about how you transform protest into progress. And everyone's welcome at 7 o'clock at the same channel. But tonight's class is the first class that's not the people's history. This is what the Progressive Network and our august faculty have inferred from what we've learned from the people's history as to how we organize to continue the struggle for the equality that the people that wrote the people's history struggled for. So it's the same struggle. And that if we don't learn from it and stand on those shoulders, we're still down in the trench and we can't see over it. So the first class, class 8, there's 8, 9, and 10, and class 8 is theory. Class 9 is strategy and tactics, and class 10 is practice. And so you will be asked to report at class 10 on what it is that you want to do with what you've learned. And we'll lay out a bunch of options, and they're available online. We'll send things out about things to choose from. history is unfolding rapidly before us, and we have many opportunities here in these dual crises of pandemic and white supremacy showing its divisive power. But the class tonight on theory was, we're looking at theory that drives everything. We're looking at the theories that drive our economy, the theories that drive our politics, the theories that drive our relationships. And I've always liked to think that politics is simply the relationship between people. I mean, it can be, you and I can have politics, and we have that as we organize larger and larger elements of society. There's no real functional magic way that it works perfectly anywhere. And that democracy is the worst of all systems except everything else. And that as long as you've got humans involved, there's going to be some dynamic tension. But I want to share my screen with you for a bit here, and hopefully won't lose your pictures. Can everybody still see themselves there in the gallery view? Somebody say something. Can you see the gallery view of the people?
Yes.
Okay, and the PowerPoint. You see both of them at the same time. Wonderful. And so politics determine how society puts human values to work. We're seeing that played out really differently right now around the world, given the pandemic, which is a real test of healthcare. And you probably know, if you're bright enough to be in the Modjeska School, that of the first world countries, the industrial democracies, the United States is the only one that doesn't have healthcare as a right. Now there's, I think, 23 nations in some other club, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, and only the United States does not have universal healthcare in the 24, in a large percentage of the industrial world that has actually not only universal healthcare, not only adequate healthcare, but better health statistics than the United States for less money. And so that when you put Joe Biden, I think, said, don't show me your values, show me your budget, and I'll tell you your values. Joe is right. Politics determines how society puts their human values to work, and ours suck. What values? Yeah. Does anyone want to comment on what values our political system is evidencing today?
Greed.
Greed, organized, yes, organized greed. That's capitalism.
Hatred.
Oh, it's getting rougher. Yeah. One of the realities that we'll get into when Dr. Shaw talks about capitalism is the inherent need for somebody to lose, for somebody to win. You build that into a system and you're going to create an underclass. And a bright guy once said, the worst thing a society can do is create a class of people with nothing to lose. And the folks that are out there throwing the rocks, they ain't got nothing to lose. I would imagine I know they have minimally adequate education. That's all we afford them, which doesn't allow them to get a job. And if they got a job, we don't have unions. We don't even have one of 5 states without a minimum wage. We don't have health care. They didn't get good education, jobs. I say, no wonder they're mad. And so they had all these wonderful talking heads and civil rights leaders yesterday talking about how people just need to go and register and vote. But everybody that was talking has something that they would lose. They've got things to lose. The people they're talking to don't have anything to lose. That's the danger in a society that's predicated on power, profit, and greed. Political theory number 1, it's all about money and power. So when we started the Progressive Network, we had been doing, even before the network, working with a regional coalition on money and power. And the first thing we did was to get we wanted to go down and find out how much anybody was getting money to the politicians. And South Carolina was the only state then, it's 1998, that didn't have campaign finance filings available online for the public. You had to go to the Ethics Commission. I mean, no matter where you were in the state, you had to drive to Columbia, go to the Ethics Commission, sign in, and then sign out the form for the person you wanted to see. And then they would then tell the politician that, so-and-so came in and pulled your form, and you couldn't take anything out. You could take notes, you couldn't copy stuff. And so we worked with our progressive representatives at the time, Joe Neal and Gilda Cobb-Hunter, and introduced legislation for campaign finance reform. And one of the bills was for public financing. And working on this, it was clear that we needed to know who was funding what. And so we got a grant, $10,000 grant, and asked the director of the Ethics Commission if we could copy some things. And he said, yes. And he said, what do you want? We said, everything. And we spent 600 hours and copied an entire election cycle and sent that off to the National Institute of Money and State Politics. And you don't need to remember the name of it. You need to remember the email address, and it's easy, followthemoney.org. And so you can go to followthemoney.org and see who you gave money to in South Carolina. This is a state legislative database, and it's got the governor too, state offices. There are plenty of websites out there with federal disclosures. This followthemoney.org is the only one that's useful for state offices. And I was able to, over the years, I've been able to use it to determine that who's funding what. That the electrical industry and the utilities and all those people were the ones that paid for the lobbyists and the lawyers that passed the Baseload Review Act that has us holding $9 billion in debt for a dead nuclear reactor. So follow the money and you'll find out what's happening. And so the money is built into our system. I mean, we practice politics here. If in places that, if we did it in England and most of the European nations, you would go to jail. I mean, they're actually, there's some states worse than we are in Texas and North Carolina. Judges run for office. They take campaign contributions in North Carolina, Lewis.
You bet.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you're a crook, you know where you want to put your money. Put your money on the judge. And so the system is set up is if money is a very critical element of it that's somehow legitimate. And Professor Pitts will be speaking to the nature of that money control by being organized as corporations when I get through talking here. So when you follow the power and you follow the money, you find a great divide. And that the divide is between the citizens. There's like 3.2 million voters, and the politicians. There's only 170 legislators and 9 constitutional officers in South Carolina. And then there's corporations. And so the corporations, interestingly enough, are very vested in politics. If you've ever spent any time at the State House, there are these people in the lobby that are called lobbyists. And they're there for a reason. They're paid by the corporate powers to be able to influence the legislature, to whom they give contributions. And when you follow the money, you find out in South Carolina that the people, that's us, you and me and everybody else, the whole damn bunch of us, the contributions below $200 amount to less than 4 to 5% of the entire take of the entire budget that goes into all of the campaigns in South Carolina. And there will be in some cycles, we're talking about scores of millions of dollars with just tiny percentage coming from the public. Self-financing by politicians is the next largest percentage, around 15%. And then corporate donations range around 80 to 85%. And so in the best tradition of the free market, who owns the elections? Somebody guess. Who owns the elections?
Money.
The people that pay for them, correct. Thank you. Yeah, so you pay for it, you own it. And I have been spending way too much time over the years. I don't go up there that often now, but you know quite clearly who the big time lobbyists are, and you know where the money is. You know who's taking the money. You know who's making the decisions. You know the influence. Like there's, I'll cite a bill right now that's not yet a law. The governor just released on Tuesday his Accelerate SC task force report. Now that's a task force he put together to open South Carolina up and put us back to business. And that there are many people that think that's a little premature. There are other people that think that if you're going to do that, You need to use the best science and healthcare, and you really should take advice from the workers. Well, the governor's task force had no scientists, it had no health people, it had no workers. It was lobbyists. And as a matter of fact, it's the same lobbyists that we've been fighting that have been suppressing worker rights for decades now. And so the Restaurant and Retail Association is one that I love to pick on. From 2007 to 2011, I was involved in trying to promote sick leave. And part of that was in response to an effort on the part of the American Legislative Exchange Council, which, if you don't know about ALEC, write that down and Google it. ALEC, ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. There are any number of significant committee heads in the state legislature are ALEC task force members. And so in 2011, Portland became the first city to pass a sick leave bill requiring businesses that had over X number of people to do earn sick leave, and they had more employees you had to do earn paid sick leave. And so it was a descending amount of leave you could get predicated on how many employers the company had. And so what we saw coming at us was what was pretty much new at that point, was called preemptive legislation. And so these lobbyists get together that represent these corporations. And Yum Foods was one of them. They own Pizza Hut, and I own Pepsi. They own all kind of stuff. But they get these lobbyists and lawyers that create these preemptive legislation that try and stop you from doing something. They're trying to prevent you from passing a law preemptively. And so the bill that Governor McMaster signed in 2017 actually prohibits towns, counties in South Carolina from passing any law that would require a company to have an employee benefit or sick leave. So not only does the United States is the only country in this club of rich countries that doesn't have sick leave as a right. So not only do we not have sick leave as a right, we have laws against sick leave in South Carolina. And it was convenient for them to add that because they only had to tack it on the law they already passed to prevent a wage higher than the federal minimum. So we work cheap by law and we work sick by law. So that is the group passed out the task force that the governor is looking for reference to put you back to work. And so you'll be hearing more from us about that. And hopefully we're going to get some more word out. This is information that people don't want to hear and they don't believe it when they hear it. So that's a snapshot of corporate power determining our policies. Oh, for instance, the educational subcommittee was driven by people more concerned about privatizing schools than public schools. And so you see the money influencing virtually every element, every policy that we implement for the people. And political power, there's nothing in the Constitution about political parties. Now, is this 650? Okay, I think I'm supposed to do this one. But one of the things that you need to know to be able to talk to people and be able to convince them that they need to take another look at the way we're practicing politics in America is the fact that there are no parties in the Constitution, and that George Washington actually warned against parties. He warned that if we have parties, they're going to end up with two fighting amongst themselves for money and power. That was his farewell address. And we're on George Washington's side. We agree with that. President Adams said that two great parties in opposition to each other would be the greatest political evil under our Constitution. Now, did anybody learn that in high school or college? Dr. Shaw, you teach that?
Yes, in part I do.
There's another peculiar concept that we practice here. It's called voter registration. And it's an alien concept to places that have democratic elections. Where did it come from? Does anybody know when voter registration started or why?
The progressive era finger quotes.
Well, 1824, Columbia, South Carolina was one of the first places in America to have voter registration. And they nailed a list of the white male property owners over 21 to the door of the courthouse. That's who could vote. So voter registration has always been used in the United States to suppress voting. And it primarily around race. I mean, certainly around gender until, well, we still haven't passed the Equal Rights Amendment in South Carolina, so that suppression is still going on. But
I will add that the period at the turn of the century was particular about the suppression of the vote. This is where we saw national elections turnoff actually drop precipitously because of the various, along with the disenfranchisement of African Americans, the practices that would suppress the working class from voting.
Yeah, those were, you're talking about with the turn of the century, from the 1800s to the 1900s. Correct. And that was when the Jim Crow constitutions happened all over the South. So there's again those numbers that I talked about the campaign contributions. I'm trying to restrain the dog here. Becky's dealing with a dog, lovely puppy. And now we're going to bring you really much more depressing information from Professor Lewis Pitts. And I hope that some of you had the opportunity to read Lewis's resignation letter that he turned into the North Carolina Supreme Court. Lewis actually was a people's lawyer, and Lewis represented people that got in trouble. And Lewis, I was one of Lewis's most frequent clients. And the oxymoron of being a labor lawyer in South Carolina is that you work for corporations, but Lewis was actually a people's lawyer, and we're honored to have Lewis. He's been somebody that I've called on any number of times and fought many good fights. And Professor Pitts was involved with the POCLAD. I can't remember what it's the
program on corporations, law, and democracy.
And yeah, and POCLAD was an organization that the network signed up with when it first launched, and became a signer of the move to amend the Constitution to declare that corporations aren't people. Lewis, take it from there and tell me what you want.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to get to speak to all of you. Brett, if it's not, as you said earlier, too laborious, if you could get rid of that slide, I like being able to see the people, even though I'm not in person with them. I think I can talk more meaningfully if I'm talking with people. But anyway, well, thank you. That's a big help. I want to basically try to go back, if you will, a long time ago and do a big sweep of history about corporate power and the theory that corporations rule. And if we don't believe that, I think we should. And if we do believe that corporations rule, it's very important to include that in our strategy and tactics. How do we get a democracy? So the POCLAD people, Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, and let me emphasize when that entity began, and it was before 2000 a bit. Some of the information I may have shared incorrectly with Brett, but I joined with them about the year 2000. But they were talking about our colonized minds, our colonized thinking. And part of our colonized thinking has to do with how we view corporations. So I want to go do a sweep of history. I'm going to use some language. I'm not going to be emphasizing the slavery, the racism. I'm not belittling that at all. We're covering that. We'll see. In fact, I'm going to give you a teaser later on after the Civil War. I'm going to show you in arguing for corporate personhood, I think the railroad lawyers made the first reverse discrimination argument starkly. But let's go back to Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. That's the way it was taught to me. And as you probably know, he was certainly not a good guy, nor was he a good navigator. It was a business venture put together to exploit the resources and the people around the world. Another one that we may remember is 1522. Magellan sailed around the world. Well, why? Not to do good, but imperialism. Again, that was probably the beginning of globalism, of using those entities. We also know some dates, maybe 1619. The New York Times is doing a big feature on that. About 20 slaves landed at Jamestown, Virginia. Then 1620, the Pilgrims came to Plymouth Rock on the Mayflower. We all sort of learned that. I bet we didn't learn, I sure didn't, that the Mayflower ship had already sailed to this continent 3 previous times before the Pilgrims. The Mayflower was a boat owned by a corporation called the East India Company. That's probably been across your screen at some point, but let's talk about the East India Company. It was chartered by Queen Elizabeth, chartered the corporation, Queen Elizabeth, the last day of 1600. And it was comprised of roughly 200 London merchants and noblemen who were basically stockholders. They were pooling their money to go out and sail the world to steal and exploit. Does any of this sound familiar? So, in fact, the first colony that was deeded into the colonies was Virginia, because Queen Elizabeth was the Virgin Queen. That's how we got that name. Queen Elizabeth died apparently in 1603. King James took over, King James Version of the Bible, if you want some anchor points. So that's what was going on. You had the noble elites, the government body, in conjunction with the business community, sailing the world for exploitation. By 1681, most members of English Parliament were shareholders in this entity. And the Virginia Company that had been deeded by Queen Elizabeth, there were interlocking boards of directors between the East India Company and the Virginia Company. And when these charters were handed out by the Queen, they gave the chartered entity the power to, listen to this, plant, govern, and rule. So this notion of the corporate business entities ruling is far from anything new. So I'm having to skim a lot to stay within my time and get us up to today. By 1760s, so 1600, we get it started. 1760, the East India Company had amassed a large amount of wealth and property and power. They were operating and controlling in India and China. There's a story I could tell about the founding of Yale University, but it's not worth the time. But they were in competition, of course, all this time. There were Dutch India companies and the Portuguese were, so there was combat, if you will. There was this kind of stuff going on around the world, this competition. So by the 1770s, now we're getting close to what, 1776, Declaration of Independence. By the 1770s, the East India Company was in massive debt. That's what these rascals do. They spend, they pay themselves, but they go in debt. And they were having to start taking some action. So what do we know, even from our time, if corporations are going in debt, they go to their governmental entity, here it's the same hand, and they start asking for belt tightening. They start making it to their advantage, because by the 1770s, you had the American colonies, we'll call them the American, there's more than one America, the emerging merchants there. They had purchased some of their own ships. They were trading, American young merchant, young in growth, were purchasing from the Dutch. They were buying products at a better price. So East India Company lobbies, without having to have too much trouble, since most of the people they were lobbying were their own shareholders, and they start passing these very restrictive rules that restricted trade and maybe required anybody but a British corporation, East India, to have a license. They were passing taxes. So we're going to get quickly here to the tea tax of 1773. And you're probably going, oh, wait a minute, something about my old history, tea tax. Shit, yes, the Boston Tea Party. But what our teachers didn't teach us, that the Boston Tea Party was about a British passed law that favored the East India Company, was designed to put out of business and crush the merchants there in Boston and in the colonies. Think of that as more like a Walmart putting out of business your mom and pop stores. That's what was going on. So I wanted to say at the very beginning, I think I highly recommend this book. Does it show up with the right words? Unequal Protection by Tom Hartman. He's not a lawyer. I say that to his credit. It's a very decent, readable book. Came out in 2002, and it's got some of the most interesting detail about the people in Boston dressing up like Native Americans, dumping what would amount to, in today's dollars, $1 million worth of tea. It was not just taxation without representation. It was the fact that they were being taxed to benefit a corporate entity that was exploiting and putting out of business the local merchants. So by making that point, I want to emphasize this wasn't, the Tea Party wasn't favoring everybody. It didn't do anything to help out the farmers who in 1773 were in debt and were needing relief. This was about protecting the merchant class, but that's the way it rolled out. And Hartman has a great chapter on that. So if you don't mind, let me give you a few quotes and see how familiar this sounds to you. About in 1773 now, what the people over here were saying. Let's see, page 56. And see if it doesn't sound familiar, but see if it sounds like anything that you were taught. There were these populists, somebody going by the name, I think fictitious name of Rusticus. Now 1776, Declaration of Independence, 1776. Listen to this. Put out a newsletter called The Alarm to the people. We are in like manner to be given up to the disposal of the East India Company, who have now the assurance to set forth in aid of the minister to execute his plan of enslaving America. Their conduct in Asia, East India Company, for some years past has given simple proof how little they regard the laws of nations, the rights, liberties, and lives of men. They've levied war, excited rebellions, dethroned lawful princes. They didn't even have a CIA. Sacrificed millions for the sake of gain. The revenues of mighty kingdoms have centered in their coffers. And these not being sufficient to glut their avarice, they have by most unparalleled barbarities, extortions, and monopolies stripped the miserable inhabitants of their property, reduced whole provinces to indigence and ruin. 1,500 thousands, it is said, perished by famine in 1 year, not because the earth denied its fruits, but because this company and their servants all engulfed all the necessaries of life and set them at so high a rate that the poor could not purchase them. And there's another example where Rusticus talks about, we've heard about Paul Revere or these night watchmen. Be on the lookout. The British are coming. They were advocating that the night watchmen every night at 12:30 say, beware of the East India Company. So at the founding of this nation, in the hearts of people was a real hostility to corporations. Now let's see how fast I can skim here. So we get into the era of the founders. And believe me, I know their stand on slavery. They all pretty much own slaves or support it. There's all that sellout. And we hear so much about James Madison and these people. Well, there are some distinctions. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison seem to believe in it rule by a guardian elite, but they didn't want a wealthy aristocracy. They wanted an elite to rule that were more simply the wise men. Whereas the Alexander Hamiltons wanted the, quote, rich and well-born to rule. They were all terrorized of the leveling spirit, which is that, thank God, inherent nature in most people that want to rise and have equality and do better for themselves and for their children. Now, the first Chief Justice of this United States, John Jay, said those who owned the company should rule it. Now, talk about colonized minds. Today, we've got this fantastic play that's been on Broadway called Hamilton, and everybody wants to go see it, and it's supposed to be great. Alexander Hamilton, he was a Wall Street guy. He literally lived on Wall Street there after the nation was founded. The first big banker, head of the Treasury. I guess, hopefully you get the picture.
Louis, you have 20 minutes at least. You could take 24.
Yeah.
We won't shut you off. Go for it.
Not more left, right? I wouldn't think.
We're good. We're 7:15.
All right. Well, I don't want to go. I know Dr. Shaw needs to talk.
Well, you were scheduled till 7:30 at least.
Okay. All right. Let's see if I can pick up the plow a little bit more and move us a little closer. So the nation was begun. There was, Jefferson had tried to put in something about anti-monopolies in the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. It didn't get in, but let me just be clear. The founders who got together in secret to found this Constitution in roughly 1787 and get the Bill of Rights by 1789, they were terrorized of what later Lincoln called government of the people, by the people, and for the people. They were scared to death of a meaningful popular democracy. And almost, at one point, they almost said, I think we give up. We need to go back to monarchy. And if you want a long but excellent book on that, The Framers' Coup, how the framers basically seized and tried to prevent that. We got rule, but all right. So early days, to have a corporation, it would take a vote to get a charter because of this history of exportation. A 2/3 vote, or sometimes a 3/4 vote of a state legislature. You know, it became, after a transformation of law, send in a few dollars to Delaware and you got a corporate charter. They used to say, write down what you're gonna do, what's your purpose. Build a canal, build a bridge, public purpose, good. Limited lifespan. You're gonna get that done in 5 years, 10, then you're done. No interlocking boards, no limited liability. If you create harm, you gotta pay for it. All the things that are bad now, that was prohibited. Now well, I don't think I have time to get into that, but there was a Supreme Court ruling in 1819 by Dartmouth College in New Hampshire that basically said, if the charter doesn't reserve some rights, then you can't end it, you can't regulate it. So that started a bit of a controversy around the nation. And all the states that existed, and we're talking about 1820s and 30s and 40s, began to modify their constitutions, state constitutions, and reserve the right. You all have it in South Carolina, I think it's Article 8, that the power to grant what corporations can do is reserved to the General Assembly, because that's the way the people want it. And you had a power to basically impose the death penalty on a corporation. Because what was going on, railroads and big steel and monopolies were taking place. Now we're gonna move up into, we're gonna finally get to sort of the personhood bit. I hadn't thought about this till I studied this. The early trains, railroads, big deal, transportation, big monopoly, gave away millions of acres of land from the federal government subsidy. Those coal-fired or wood-fired roared through a little town or a county, set the sucker on fire and ride off. So counties started imposing a higher tax on railroads, corporations, than they did on an individual to pay for the damage that they were causing. That seems a very legitimate purpose for the legislature. You can read some U.S. Supreme Court and state decisions coming out of that period leading up to the Civil War and even after that sound like Ralph Nader or sound like, I don't know, Cornel West ranting on corporations. Really powerful. But the big boys were using that power that Brett was talking about to lobby, to bring about change of law. And then I won't take the time, but there's a quote in what Brett has given, but Abraham Lincoln, before he's assassinated, is writing to somebody and says he fears the money power will take power and have more power than the Republic. And that he feared that more than the damn Confederate troops. That was going to be a next form of slavery, and use that word, for our people. That they'd have monopolies, could set prices so high that they controlled the world. So they treated, for a while, the charter like a driver's license. You're going to speed, you're going to drink, we revoking the sucker easily. So Civil War occurs, passed the Civil War amendments, 14th Amendment is passed clearly for the purpose of protecting free slaves. But the railroad lawyers and the railroad presidents and their senators, they're mostly some of the same people, begin to start, wait a minute, this thing says equal protection for all persons. Let's start arguing that the railroad corporation, by being taxed more than the people, is being deprived equal protection. So by 1877, at least 4 times, the U.S. Supreme Court had a case and ruled, frankly, BS. That is not the purpose of the 14th Amendment. It was not to regulate commerce. It was to ensure protections for freed slaves. But they kept pounding. Now, a name, this may be familiar to some of you, Roscoe Conklin, lawyer, former senator. W.E.B. Du Bois defines Conklin as the leader of the capitalist class during Reconstruction to set the terms to ensure that the Northern capitalists would have the senior partnership as this thing started to, continue, and that the slave owners got in subservient to. And he helped orchestrate the Hayes-Tilden Compromise, which, if you remember, was 1877. So Conklin had been a senator when the 14th Amendment was passed. He put out a big lie, claimed, well, I have a journal that shows when we were discussing that, we thought corporations were to be treated as persons. Well, that turned out to be a big lie. Now, there was a case argued in the U.S. Supreme Court, San Mateo, California, versus Southern Pacific Railroad, argued in 1883. This is when I believe was the first clearly disgusting reverse discrimination argument. The time is short. I want you to hear a little bit. This is the transcript of the railroad lawyer Silas W. Sanderson arguing, quote, it's very clear if we look back over the history of the past 20 years that this country has done a great deal for members of the Negro race. It's made for them free men. It's placed them on par and equality with the white man. Now, this is 1883 now, okay, 1883. But that is none too much. We do not complain of that. We only say that something should be done now for the poor white man. We ask that he be lifted up and put on a level with the Negro. We ask that this 14th Amendment be so construed as to concede to the white man equal rights under the Constitution with the black man. And it goes on in that disgusting vein. That decision never came down because they settled the case. But that's what these rascals were all about. They kept pounding, and finally a case comes before them in 1886 that probably you heard of, Santa Clara, California County, Southern Pacific Railroad, same scenario, railroad taxed higher. The case went to the Supreme Court. The railroad had put up 6 different defenses as to why they didn't have to pay that tax more than the person would. One was the constitutional issue, is that they had rights under the 14th Amendment. That opinion expressly says we are not addressing the constitutional question. We do not address that. So therefore, there was no discussion of policy, law, wisdom, anything. But through the biggest legal scam that I know about, the court reporter back then, who was a Harvard graduated lawyer, put in a head note in the case. Maybe you know what a head note is. Before the text of a 50 or a 20-page opinion, somebody writes a little summary, not the justices. The clerk of court back then, J.C. Bancroft Davis, former railroad president, said, the court does not wish to hear argument on the question of whether the provision of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which forbids the state to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, applies to these corporations. We are of all of the opinion that it does. And that's the foundation. From there on, corporations were provided with First Amendment personhood rights. They could go into court and sling that bullshit out and overrule and declare it unconstitutional the few laws that the people were finally able to persuade their elected officials that might protect their health, welfare, and safety. So we know that Citizens United was passed in 2010. Some people misunderstand, oh, corporations they've had that First Amendment right to spend. It just became more clear. They've had a Fourth Amendment right. Used to, OSHA could go to the corporation and say, bum, 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 here we come. We hear you got a safety violation. Or boom, we don't have a warrant because you're a corporation. We want to see your books. Now the government, law enforcement has to get a warrant and prove probable cause. They're treated like persons. Now, there is a slide in what Brett has out. I wouldn't put it up, but in 1938, U.S. Justice Hugo Black from Alabama, some of you may know, I think he was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. But he wrote in one of his cases, and he found that in the first 50 years after the passage of the 14th Amendment, 0.5% of the cases bringing the 14th Amendment granted its application to African Americans, whereas more than 50% of the cases gave protections to corporations. So we move on into the Gilded Age. 1900s is just more power. The more power, as Brett was pointing out, that the corporations have, the more lobbyists they hire. There's a major transformation of law, and we end up with what we've got now. Now let me do a sort of a quick skim up here. That's outrageous. But think about this. Under Bill Clinton, the Democrat, we got the World Trade Organization. Now, remember early when I started, who rules? The World Trade Organization that we joined is a global, international, secret body made up of corporate lawyers who take turns being the tribunal of chiefs. And they take cases raised by one corporation against, not so much against another, but against a nation or a state. California passes a law and says, you can't put this additive in your gasoline. The oil company goes to the World Trade Organization and said, if they make us do that, they are depriving us of profits. And in secret, nobody can go. There's no repress. They make rulings like that. And I don't know where we've been. I've been out there trying to fuss and fight as much as I can. But we've basically allowed secret cabals of corporate governance to rule the world. Now, Bill, there's not enough time, but my latest passion is Wall Street. Here's one thing I would urge you to do. There's a website. It's called Wall Street on Parade. Easy to remember that. Wall Street on Parade. You can, for free, get them to send you an email every day. It's a little longer than an op-ed, and it's current about what's going on. It's a man and wife, husband and wife run it. The one today, look at it today. It's titled Financial Lynchings. And it's a tight summary. And I think it makes the argument when we're framing today's strategies in the pandemic and in the era of cops killing people with impunity, we have to raise the injustice of the trillions of dollars that are being created by a keystroke, a computer keystroke by the Federal Reserve that are handed out overnight in secret as loans to Wall Street, to Goldman Sachs. The last 17 years, our Secretary of Treasury has been from Goldman Sachs. And in that article today, if you will look at June 1, financial lynchings, it trashes Obama, because what he was doing after the crisis of mortgages, foreclosures, 2008, he had just begun elected. He was, you can read the emails where Citibank was saying, we want you to pick Hillary Clinton as your Secretary of State. We want you to pick Eric Holder to be the Attorney General. And down the line, Eric Holder is picked, Hillary Clinton is picked. Eric Holder is one who eventually issues a memo. We got all of this corruption, fraud, leverage loans, derivative, shitting black people out of loans and forcing these damn armed mortgage rates. Interesting, the houses are being foreclosed. They're too big to fail. We're not going to prosecute them. And it goes on and on and on, and it will until we stop it. And I thank you for letting me rant so on that. And I'd love to, if there's even a second or two, hear your feedback.
We've got an hour left, and Todd probably doesn't need more than 30 minutes. And so please take questions.
Let me just, does that make sense, or was that just a windbag rant from me? I'm asking that seriously.
It makes no sense what they're doing, Lewis, but you were perfectly clear. Let's see what the people have to say here.
Okay.
And Lewis, you made my job easier.
Thank you. I'm glad.
I think that obviously you explained it so well there's no questions, but the thing is that what you're talking about is history at a national level and on an international level of the corporate control. But what we have going on in South Carolina today, forcing workers back to work, not providing safety equipment, and the thing the legislature is debating to pass a law is not hold off, don't endanger workers, but to hold corporations harmless if the workers die. So the only law we're looking at passing in regards to COVID is to put people back to work and hold the corporations harmless. And so
I have a question. The dates that you gave, I think, were very, very instructive in terms of building up the database of what has happened. Is that what was on the PowerPoint?
No, those were not in the PowerPoint. I got those from general research, but in particular, unequal protection.
Okay.
Which is a good read. And
hold it up a little further.
This piece that I was reading about reverse discrimination, if you can go to the POCLAD website, at the top of their website, you will see some different categories like most homepages do. One will say, by what authority, or BTW. There's a Latin phrase, that's given the power of the people to go and basically dethrone a corporation, or it did. and they'll have a list of articles under by what authority. Look, and it'll be by dates. Look under the year 2003, the birth of the white corporation. That's where you'll see a good bit of this. And let me, if I could make one point maybe clear that has been fuzzed over. I'm not saying that we don't pick up issues in South Carolina or that we don't fight voter suppression. I totally believe it. But when we have people sick and when we have people laid off and if they get to not go back to work, it costs money. Remember how when Bernie and Elizabeth were arguing for Medicare for all? Oh, it's cost too damn much. If you juxtapose the money that's been thrown out and created and handed, so these Wall Street cats can make $1 million a month in a consulting fee, and you juxtaposition that with how, what, we get $600, we get a $1,200 payment. It's going to stop unless we demand. It's not an absence of money. It's an absence of us generating the political power to seize this revolutionary moment and talk about the immorality of feeding that finance monster and all the rest of these corporations with the argument Brett's making. They're going to get limited liability or no liability for killing people. And I guess hopefully you see my point. That's why I think this is important, that the trillions of dollars are out there to feed people, to stop the utilities from being cut off, and to treat people. And don't say that there's no money. Just stop them from doing that.
Question.
Yeah.
About your presentation relative to Wall Street.
Yes, sir.
There was a program on Frontline about maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And it was outlining Brooksley Born. Are you familiar with her? And can you elaborate a bit on her role in exposing the black box dealings of Wall Street?
Yes, she was one of the regulators, and that there's a rich history. If you use Wall Street on Parade and start going back to those issues, they will have links, and you gradually, or you look up her name. She was a regulator. She started blowing the whistle. She started finding out that this thing of creating bubbles, you know, it's so complicated, and I'm not an expert. I know a little bit more than I used to know, but they basically take, well, like they take bad, let's see, you could have, remember the dot-com crisis, dot-com, there'd be two slackers in a cubicle that had a business, and they would do a public offering on Wall Street at $9 a day, and then with this gin up, at the end of the day, that stock might be worth $500. And in a few days, it would be a company purportedly worth $5 billion. This is an example. So everybody wants in on it. You put your money in there. Your pension fund puts money in it. That bubble goes up. And what do then Wall Street guys start doing then? Hedge funds come in and say, I'm on a bet that thing crashes because it smells horrible. So then Wall Street, same bank, right down the hallway in the same bank, their brokers start selling bets called betting short that some cats are going to make money when that one crashes. You and I and our pension funds and our IRAs get this one, the risky, the junk bonds. Now they've rigged it. You can get a junk bond, might even be sometimes rated AAA. And all of that corruption, Born and the ones that you were just mentioning, there were people out there fussing about this. The woman that writes the columns, and let me stop. Go ahead, whoever wanted to. As shitty as I've always thought the corporate world was, excuse me, it's so devious. It's so devious, and nobody seems to be willing to touch it.
Brett called you Professor Pitts, so I'll call you Professor. This concept of corporate personhood was born in a head note in a ruling from 1880 something, you said, the Santa Clarita, California case against Southern Railroad. From 1880 until 2020 is a period of 140 some years. So since the concept itself existed only in a head note in a judicial ruling, why has the question not been litigated under more favorable conditions? Or why has no member of Congress or the Senate, at least to my knowledge, maybe you know of some cases, offered legislation to undo what has been stated in this head note?
Well, why it went on so long, I guess, is like, why did we have slavery so long? Why did Plessy versus Ferguson? I was practicing lawyer for 43 years. It takes a lot of money and a lot of time and high-paid lawyers like the railroads have to work out a strategy. It took Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston decades to map out a strategy to try to desegregate. There hasn't been the same. You're correct on that. But if not before, but when Citizens United came out, Poclad and others came out with Move to Amend, and y'all's organization were one of the early members on that. There have been a few people. There have been city councils all over, I forget the exact details now, hundreds of local entities that have passed resolutions calling for that we need something to end it. It needs to be a constitutional amendment, frankly, or this Congress could pass it, and the next time another one comes in, they undo it. But I think that your point demonstrates we don't rule. We don't have democracy. We have corporate rule by a guardian elite. And we never did have it. This notion of getting back to democracy, of the people, by the people, for the people, is sort of a misstatement. And I know we've got college professors, and I think at least one or more high school, the idea of what y'all are able to do in teaching this. Think about it. Every politician you know, including Donald Trump, when they campaign as populist. They know that people are fed up with this. We don't have to take the temperature where the people are, because they know it. The swamp, he called it. But as what's the woman who's quote deaf and dumb said, what's her name? Helen Keller. She said, "This is awful. I get to vote for Tweedledee or Tweedledum. We get to vote for Biden or Trump, please."
Then let me go, if you don't mind, one step further and ask, has in that 140-year period, the question not been raised as a matter of public discourse? Has no senator, I'm thinking Robert La Follette, I'm thinking of the most liberal end of members of Congress and members of the Senate. Has nobody even brought this to the public forum on the floor of Congress or the floor of the Senate to discuss the question of corporate personhood?
I wouldn't say nobody's ever done it. It's never gotten much energy and horsepower. And I give, as limited as I have been born, raised, and miseducated in South Carolina, I tried hard to find all the radical information I could. It wasn't until the year 2000 when I stumbled into these Poclad people, then they were doing around the nation rethinks about corporate personhood. And I was furious. There's that hidden history. And so this is an issue that is up, and there's a lot out there. You will be impressed and surprised at what you can find and learn for free from that Poclad. And it was like 8 or 10 of us. I'm 72, some of them are older than I am and are already dead. But Move to Amend is an important one out there with younger people. And I think when you look, you'll be surprised. There have been these mushrooms of this resistance out there, but it's almost like asking, why hasn't anybody raised police violence and misconduct? And why hasn't it stopped? Not because people haven't been trying. We just don't have the adequate power. We got it. It's not being wielded, I guess. And I don't have any magic solution on how to do that. other than organize, 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 and things like you all are doing.
Well, we all need to give Professor Pitts a large hand and appreciate his sticking up for us. And that's what he's talking about right there.
That's Tweedledee or Tweedledum, I guess.
It's your choice. And
Thanks for the extra time. Dr. Scott, I apologize if I stepping over into your space.
Dr. Shaw, take it.
All right. Thank you much. You can advise me, Brett, whether or not, in your experience, clips like YouTube have played very well on Zoom. I don't know if they do. I was going to try one little experiment to see. I don't know if you've had an experiment with it. If it doesn't work, or Robert, Professor Green.
I know we've had a couple play before via YouTube that have played fine.
Okay.
I would suppose. Yeah.
Okay. All right then. So what I want to do is, and I'm going to, I think what I'll do, Brett, is I have the slides on my end, and so I might pull up the slides so you don't have to go back and forth. I'll click on the file shares. So let me start off by saying, again, thank you to Professor Pitts, because he did nicely sort of set up the comments that I'm going to make, and I invite you, if you would like to just ask questions in between my presentation, to feel free. So let's see. Let's see. So I think if my screen is sharing, what I always do when I'm talking with students in a class is offer them what I always call our working definitions. And for me, a working definition means that I take seriously that really kind of every class I teach is a bit of a seminar, even if it's a larger class, and that I want the students to talk back to me and to give me some sense of, you know, the questions that they have. And so you don't necessarily have to save your questions to the end if you want to interject a comment, or you certainly can put a comment in the comment box. But let me kind of offer this sort of working definition of this 30,000-foot concept of capitalism. And then we can, as a forum, give we can have a discussion about any amendments and friendly amendments we would make to it. And so capitalism is not a political system. And the first presumption is not to assume to be democratic is to be capitalist. That's certainly a broad myth within sort of Western capitalist democracies and names, because we can certainly make an argument that in many respects, and I tried to, in an essay form, argue that the United States is no longer a republic, no longer a democracy. Now, if ever it was, is the question that Lewis brought up in his presentation, given the development and concentration of corporate power. But across many measures, the United States, you know, whether we talk about money, the influence of money, the rates of voter turnout, the degrees to which citizens actually can effectively have input, and ways in which this fragmented structure doesn't provide for really, and the degrees to which the political parties likewise represent various continuums within the American public. All of these are arguments about it not being democratic now, if it ever was. So capitalism is not a political system, but an economic system characterized by private or corporate ownership of goods, by investments that are determined by private decision, and by prices, production, and the distribution of goods that are determined mainly by competition in a free market. It is not mentioned in our Declaration of Independence, thank you, Professor Pitts, though Thomas Jefferson took property and put in happiness, excuse me, not mentioned in our Constitution, right? Though Thomas Jefferson took out property and put in happiness in our Declaration of Independence, not necessarily Bill of Rights. Let me just sort of say in that framework, based upon Lewis's discussion of Thomas Jefferson, that if you go to Thomas Jefferson's study in Monticello, among the many things you would see in there is a picture of John Locke. because he greatly admired John Locke, who was a British Enlightenment thinker and someone who is credited in part for this sort of creating these emerging notions of the rule of the consent, right? Well, John Locke also was secretary of the Crown Colonial Board, and though he talked about notions of slavery in a political sense, he actually profited from the slave trade in an actual sense. And John Locke said in the Second Treatise on Government that individuals have the right for the pursuit of not happiness, but among those guaranteed with the pursuit of property. And so Jefferson substituted out the pursuit of happiness for the pursuit of property, but it had always been Locke's conception that political communities are created for the protection of property. So way back in the 1600s, with of course the emergence of capitalism as a system, and we can talk about this relative to some of the theory of Emmanuel Wallerstein and world systems theory, that way back with the creation of mercantilism into capitalism, that as individuals like Locke were theorizing, these theories were around this conception of property to be protected and that's the first right within a political community, to protect property. And of course, you and I both know how there was a direct linkage between property and slavery, right? And so, why Rutledge, among others, would argue that we will not join this union if our property, slaves, were not protected. And so we have that fusion, as you well know, between sort of racial hegemony and economic hegemony. Okay, let me move on a little bit more here. So what I want to do in saying this is talk about sort of this concept of the free market, but I want to also talk about the ways in which, this is where some of my videos will come in, about it's really sort of a freedom to have rampant inequality. And I know you've all sort of have read or thought about these questions around wealth and income inequality in the United States. I'm going to talk about that as a not a byproduct, but a deliberate aspect of a capitalist society. And so politicians of both parties are fans of a so-called free market. When I teach my American government class or other classes, I will talk about that that both Bill Clinton and George Bush are liberals. Now, what do I mean by that? Liberal in the sense of small L, those who believe in this notion of a liberty-oriented, that liberty is the highest good to be protected. Freedom is the highest good to be protected, right? On the Capitol of the Dome in Washington, D.C. is the Statue of Columbia, right? The goddess of freedom. And so District of Columbia, freedom. So it's all these kind of arguments about how freedom is this core value within American political philosophy. Maybe democracy, maybe some hint at equality, but really it's freedom that is at the heart of the American experiment. Well, this really means free markets and a freedom to poverty, if in fact we're talking about enormous, enormous aspects of inequality and wealth. And so, I'll talk about what are some of the downsides of a supposedly unregulated market. In fact, these are some questions that we can pose as a class. Is a free market conducive to social democracy? Is a free market actually going to produce socially equitable outcomes or an equity of outcomes, where, as Lewis talks about, these rampant inequalities in the health coverage, and we're seeing all too well in sort of COVID-19. So having said that, let me play a video from YouTube that I think you have probably seen already, and it talks, and it's a bit old. It's about 7 years old. And it sort of came out as part of an aspect of what the Occupy movement was doing. But I think in this sort of 6-minute clip, it very effectively in 6 minutes talks about the sort of the enormous inequalities of wealth in the United States as a vestige of this of capitalism and our particular monopoly capitalism economy. So let's see. I'll stop this share and let me share. This is a vestige of having too many things up. You probably really all can relate. Let's see. Show all windows. Well, no, I shouldn't do that. I'm sorry, give me 1 second. Okay. All right, then let's see if it works now. Okay. All right. And tell me if I have the sound up enough.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution, shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart, but the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So here's that ideal we asked everyone about, something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change. And the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976, they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money. But do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Okay, so at the end, it's admittedly the author does a little bit of editorializing tongue-in-cheek about quote unquote dreaded socialism. And we'll get into, and we'll have a discussion about that in a moment. But that's the bookend of this story, right? You have this amalgamation of enormous corporate power and the sort of first rights being among corporations. You have these principles about a free market, but free market means what when you have enormous inequalities that have cohered or have been produced over a number of years, over decades, over generations. And then ultimately, if you want to also ask the question as to, well, what's the political implications of this wealth inequality? Well, it's also, as scholars within comparative politics will tell you in political science, it also means that wealth inequality can lead to political instability, right? And so going back to Brett's point about the why folk have nothing to lose, point to this wealth inequality and point to this income inequality, and it produces income and it produces political instability, along with, and if you were wondering, of course, these same wealth inequalities also map on to the racial inequality. There's also an enormous racial wealth gap that has actually only grown larger over the last two decades. And so, these inequalities certainly, are a product, are a direct result of what's happening under this sort of notion of capitalism as we understand it and created in the United States. If you were just a little curious as to, well, how does this relate to what's true in South Carolina? Give me just 1 second here. I want to make sure I click on the right thing. Because I wanted to go out, and this is with the, let's see, I hope I didn't, okay, yeah. The Economic Policy Institute. Let me show you what's true in South Carolina. And this is by a more conservative measure, if you will, which is income inequality as compared to wealth inequality, which you know is the sum of persons all economic assets. All right, give me 1 second to see if I can click on this. All right, so I want to just show you this side, and I'm giving you a story that has bookends. You know, the capitalist principles on the front end and the outcome on the back end. So this is from the Economic Policy Institute, and I've used some of the work, and it's a credible source of information. Let me show you sort of just, again, by the more conservative measure of wealth inequality, and you can see EPI.org. Let's look at this whole question of income inequality in the United States, right? And where that maps. And so, you know, the average annual income of the 1% is 1.3 million. The average income of everyone else is 50,000. The top 1% makes 26 times the amount of the other 99%. Then the top 1% take home 21% of all the income, not wealth, but income of the United States. So here's one family, 21%. Share of income captured by the top 1% from 1917 to 2015. And so we've seen this aspects of this curve flatten, and then lo and behold, Ronald Reagan and the neoliberal state and the emergence of this enormous income inequality that we see. And then, you know, there are a couple of things. I'll give you the link here. You can copy it down, and someone can paste it to the chat room. So you can go back and play with these charts for states you're interested in. But of course, let's look at South Carolina. So remember, it was 26%. The top 1% makes 26% more than the 99% in the United States. In South Carolina, it's 19%. That's the good news, huh? So it's only 20% more than the bottom 19%. About $700,000 in terms of the 1%. The average income of everyone else is $38,000. So and if you let 1% in South Carolina in terms of income takes on 16% of the income. But you and I just saw wealth and income. There's a difference between the two, given the enormous inequalities of wealth versus income. And then South Carolina basically has followed a national trend in terms of the peaks and valleys with regards to income inequality from 1917 to 2015. And so goes this inequality in the United States, so goes this inequality in South Carolina, okay? So I just wanted to bookend my comments to give you some sense of what we're up against. And so let me kind of finish out my comments, because I want us to, because I know we want to leave time for questions. So let me quickly finish up here. And so, you know, the politicians, you know, both parties are fans of the so-called free market. You know, the fact that and there's a book by Jacob Hacker called The Divided Welfare State. The Divided Welfare State, if you might consider it for your reading. And Hacker very, very, very nicely talks about, well, why do we see the ways in which the United States has a welfare state that, why does our social security system look as it does? Why does our healthcare system look as fragmented and provide so little coverage as compared to Western democracies? And it really kind of, other Western democracies, and it really kind of parallels, again, what Lewis is talking about, the power of the corporation and the presumption of the free market, and that employers should provide, right? Employers should be the main impetus through which we fund a social security blanket and sort of those SSI deductions. Employers should be the main engine through which people receive their health care. All of these presumptions being a part of the capitalist presumptions we have here in the United States. And so I want to kind of wrap up in 5 minutes, because we really do want time. So examples, and I say that, let's come back to some of these questions here. Is a free market So what are the downsides of a supposedly unregulated market? Is a free market conducive to social democracy? I'm going to leave those for questions for us to have as part of our discussion. Examples of mixed economies, where there are arguments about, so ultimately, is there not a social cost if the social contract of the society does not have fundamental economic rights for citizens, right? Economic rights, a fundamental floor with regards to healthcare, a fundamental floor with regards to minimum income, a fundamental floor with regards to the ability of individuals for the right to organize at their workplace. So all of these things, to organize their labor. So all of these things being a presumption about the social contract we don't have in our virtue of a more brutal version of capitalism, right? And so, and this speaks to American exceptionalism in some ways, right? And so examples of mixed economies, the share of the government GDP as a share of government spending as a percentage of the GDP. Iceland, 57%, Sweden, 52%, France, 52%, the United Kingdom, 47%, the United States, 38%, Russia, 34%, China, 20%. And so how our definition of social welfare spending and the way in which we have, since another economic crisis that prompted some degree to which a capitalist nation was going to create at least a basic social safety net that had not existed up until that point. Because lo and behold, we find out when you have 25% unemployment and prolonged economic malaise that you need ways in which Americans have some basic income. And so the way in which we may denigrate notions of social democracy, but then look at the health outcomes and social outcomes of all these other nations that are doing just fine relative to the share of GDP spending that the government assumes. And so the exchange between enormous inequality and freedom, right? the idea of, okay, well, we have freedom, but we have enormous inequality and enormous disparities as a result. And the main difference between capitalist and social systems is the government's role in looking out for people's economic well-being. Is economic or social democracy possible without political democracy? Can a free market capitalist system be truly democratic? And what are examples of structural inequality in South Carolina? We talked about this question in South Carolina relative to income inequality real quickly. And I'm sorry, forgive me, Brad, I'm going a little longer than I should be.
Todd, that 30+% in the U.S. in our spending on government expenses, that includes military?
Yes.
Well, we spend more on military than all the other countries combined.
Yes.
Subtract that out.
Right. All right. Let me see here. I wanted just to show you, well, we can talk about a group called the Southern Carolina Policy Council and its backing of right to work states. So when we're talking about the individuals arrayed on the other side defending the status quo, put the South Carolina Policy Council in your playbook. But I wanted to show you just at my last show and tell here, and then we'll finish up the slides. And let's see if this will come up. Forgive me for how this shows up, but I thought I would go just to the US Bureau of Labor Statistics and tell you something you already know. And by the way, you can download this particular chart and as an Excel table. And I know it's real busy here, but what I wanted to simply look at is sort of the Bureau's collection of union affiliation of employed wage and salary workers by state. And so we'll just do some eyeball statistics, 2018, 2019. I'll just look at 2018, and you look Alabama 9%, and this is the members of all the employed that are persons who are employed are members of unions. So 9% in Alabama, 18.5% in Alaska, Arizona 5.3. Again, this is more alphabetical order. So you keep going down, you're seeing, well, okay, 5% Louisiana, right. 14% New Jersey, correct. South Carolina, 2.7%. 2.7%. Let's since we like that Mississippi comparison, Mississippi, 5.1%. So speaking about sort of the right to work state that we are, and the level of unionization and income inequality and the inability to see and the persistence of these gaps, in what ways does, when we talk about this notion of social democracy, that you can fundamentally align with at least what the American public may believe is a more equitable system? How does the ability for people to mobilize and work at the workplace, or organize at the workplace, matter in that regard? Okay, so rounding the corner, and I won't say in conclusion for the third time. Both professors and preachers do that. So rounding the corner, democratic socialism. A main difference between capitalist and socialist systems is the government's role in looking out for people's economic well-being. Is economic or social democracy possible without political democracy? Can a free market capitalist system be truly democratic? And examples of structural inequality. Democracy in South Carolina being dead, even the democratic part of our notions of the American sense of self is dead. There is no use pretending that South Carolina is a democracy when 72% of the citizens have only one person to vote for, and our legislators are chosen in the primaries by fewer than 9% of the people. And what are we going to do about it? I come back around to that final slide. Let me stop it there.
So, Dr. Shaw, the messages were screwed. We need to lift them up now.
No. No, I think actually, Brett, I think in some respects then, the questions that the Progressive Network has been raising about educating, agitating, legislating, litigating, organizing, and repeating, right? And so what we said at the beginning, I'm glad you raised that, because not leaving folks down in the dumps. What we said at the beginning is, at least if we start our analysis, and I know we'll continue our conversation next week, but if we start our analysis where we did with this class of follow the money, follow the political power, follow the corporate concentration, we at least have some sense, and then follow the laws that support all of those structures. And that's really structural inequality. It's all the laws, the legal infrastructure, the political system that undergirds the economy that produces these economic inequalities. I think the first thing for us to do is to understand and diagnose the problem, right? And if more South Carolinians know, or if we were to ask more South Carolinians, and they gave a similar answer to what was said in that video about, even if we were to maintain our American sense of self and capitalism, shouldn't it look more like this? I mean, when you ask individuals about Medicare for all, and depending on how you word that question, how, and in fact, you have pluralities to majorities of Americans saying principles of that concept make sense, right? I mean, that's what was brilliant about Sanders and Warren's framing. It's something Americans already know. Medicare works well. Why? And it's reduced healthcare, disparities and terrible outcomes for the elderly. Then why not for all? And so, again, I think it's about framing as we educate. And so we can get to other parts of the organizational tree, but I think the education and the framing is the first leg. Other questions, folks? We have about 10 minutes or so. And you can tell me, like, similar to what Brett said, if I left you completely depressed.
Well, I would hope that people realize they've got to figure out how deeply the screw is screwed in before we can unscrew it.
Right.
And these are things that some of us have been dealing with for many, many years. And I learned a lot of this from Modjeska, who in 1946 had a conference with 400 young people from black people from South Carolina at the Student Negro Youth Congress at the Township Auditorium at a time when black people and white people couldn't be there, with 170 white people talking about building a multiracial, class-conscious movement. We've been here. We've been here. They were lynching people then. It was rough. We've been here. And you know what happened? They got smashed. And part of who smashed them was the people that were more acceptable, was a term that was used when I read about the first 3 black people that were elected in 1970. The Democratic Party grudgingly opened the door to black people. They found ID Quincy Newman more acceptable, was what was written in the newspaper. And so that's the leadership that we've had here for so long, and that it's really up to us, folks. There's no party. We are the party, and that's the movement we're trying to build. And I really do appreciate Dr. Shaw and Professor Pitts, and certainly Dr. Green, for being the anchor of this team that's going to carry on, certainly after I've gone to visit Modjeska and the Great Reward up there. So let's take some questions.
Well, it's not a question as much as it is an observation. Part of what happens, how this idea of freedom in the U.S. in particular, what is freedom? We have freedom to own property, but what happens is that, or has happened, is that the idea of a free market somehow philosophically has been, conflated with freedom of an individual. Your personal freedom is reflected in the ability, the freedom to participate in the capitalist economy. Your freedom to go out there and sell your labor, your freedom to go out there and get screwed like that cartoon was doing. So, and that education-wise, that's to me, I've experienced that as being a big hurdle to try and share that with people, that the idea of your freedom, your liberties, is not the same as the freedom of a capitalist society to, competition that ends up with monopolies. Capitalism is built on the idea that somebody is going to continue to accumulate. Somebody is going to continue to do better than everybody else. That's the way the system works. So the part of the education is to just try and clarify for people that the freedom to participate in a capitalist economy is not the same thing as personal freedoms, as liberties.
I would agree, and I think talk about, if it's in this, not to just sort of borrow from Roosevelt in the Four Freedoms, but how do you rephrase that notion of freedom? Freedom from poverty, right? Freedom from enormous, freedom from, terrorism by the police. Freedom. So I think in some respects, this is true for all social movements that find effective bridging frames. They take concepts and words that people already understand and feel they can grasp onto, and find a new way for people to understand, use that same concept, but in a new way. That actually kind of syncs up with something they already believe. And so to your point, Rick, if someone is to argue, well, the reason I don't join the labor union is it keeps me free from, and then you say, well, okay, should there be an absolute freedom against, should there be some freedom against exploitation? Is there freedom, as Brett making the point about, freedom from having a minimum wage? Is that a freedom that really makes sense? So I'm not being articulate about it, but I think that we could use those core notions to come up with a new framing that really kind of does sync with what individuals may already, at some level, at a grassroots level, believe. Other questions? Any other questions? Other comments?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
Have you done any, you had a chart with the union participation per state. And have you done any research on the profitability of automotive manufacturers in particular? As many of you know, I'm from Michigan. I
Yes.
spent a great deal of my career in and out of the automotive manufacturers, GM in particular. And back to the question, have you done any research about the profitability of the automotive manufacturers that are now in South Carolina? I think BMW and Mercedes, relative to
Although
historically union membership and profitability back in the days of Detroit, the 70s, the 60s, when they were at their heyday.
I have not done research in that regard, but I can tell you what direction. In fact, I may, to your point, West, I will be happy to bring some data back with me at a next class period. I think what we could do, because actually some of this is about me as a political scientist and understanding sort of these broader political theories. I'm going to call on also some friends who I know are labor historians and pull and look at these questions about, you could also say this from the standpoint of right to work states. Yeah. And you can look at this from the standpoint, because actually it's funny you talk about Detroit. I spent a little time in Ann Arbor and then did my dissertation on Detroit activism. And so I'm very familiar with the Detroit history to this question of labor activism. So I'll be happy to bring back next week a few sources for you in that regards, because I think you're right to have this comparison would be a useful one about furthering this framework of are you absolutely certain that this economic profitability of these corporations is redounding to the benefit of the workers? Yeah.
Right, and I apologize. I didn't quite know your background.
Oh, no problem at all. No problem at all.
Whether it translated to a lot of economic study. So I didn't mean to open up a big huge thing.
Oh, no. Actually, I mean, as a researcher, I'm happy to pull stuff.
Yeah. The other kind of corollary to that is that with the profitability statistics relative to union membership and right to work states, what have you, you also have the specter of how much of that profitability is generated from worldwide distribution. Right. In other words, when I was working in the GM world, I would often see these prints from GM of China or GM of Japan. And I would always wonder what the relationship was between that country, that government, and the corporation. I wasn't deep into that side of it from the corporate. I was on the engineering side.
Okay.
So, and then toward the end of my stay there, of my career there in Saginaw Steering is now owned by the Chinese.
Okay.
These are things you need to learn about South Carolina. There's a reason that Boeing, Michelin, BMW, Volvo are here. And
correct. I understand the reason. I understand the reason.
That we have no environmental regulations.
Exactly.
And we're cheap. And I want to leave the image in your mind and everyone else's of something the Progressive Network's been a union shop since our founding. And the group that founded the Progressive Network became a union shop in 1981. And so we have been, sadly to say, the brain trust of this tiny percentage of labor in South Carolina. But I got off an airplane when Carroll Campbell was governor in LaGuardia and walked right into a poster, covered almost the best part of the wall, of a poster of a worker in one of those white beater dirty t-shirts, big pot belly, looked like he was pregnant, had a hard hat on, a flower in his mouth, grinning. And the caption was, South Carolina has no labor pains. And here they are, hoping that nobody from South Carolina that actually is getting, screwed by their Chamber of Commerce would be looking at these posters that were recruiting people, and it said South Carolina has the lowest number of work hours lost due to labor disputes. Y'all come on down. The largest lobbyist, the largest influx of money in South Carolina in the 70s, 80s, and 90s was environmental polluters of toxic waste and nuclear waste that were driven out of the northern states and came here.
Right.
We watched the textile mills move here until it became cheaper to move to Haiti and Nicaragua.
Right.
And so we had been the stop-off point before you jump to the third world. And Nikki Haley, with her anti-union position, figured we don't have to compete with third world countries. We can be one. So welcome to South Carolina, Wes.
Yeah.
We got a lot of work to do. So I don't know, it's 8:30 now. We don't have to stop. The clock doesn't stop, but we want to give people an opportunity to go eat dinner or go to the bathroom or stay and chat for a little while.
Can I make one comment about the 2.7% unionization in South Carolina?
Sure.
Keep in mind that part of that 2.7% are national unions that they cannot keep out of the state. For instance, postal workers. All the post. Yeah, one of them. Yeah, postal workers are unionized. South Carolina can't stop that. UPS workers, Teamsters. South Carolina can't stop that. That's a national union. So I don't know how big of an impact it is, but considering the 2.7% is so small, some of that they will probably, the powers that be would like to eliminate that, but they can't get rid of it because those are national unions.
Right.
If you looked at the footnote at the bottom of that chart, it indicated that some of the individuals counted in that 2.7 were members of employee associations that function similar to unions. So they're not even unions technically for purposes of IRS regulation, but simply employee associations as well.
Yeah, the Right to Work Act is a whole nother lesson we need to have. I don't know, we brushed over that in 1954 back in the people's history, but really understanding the vicious nature of our government against working people, it's staggering, and we'll come back to that later. We have a deeper dive planned for next Monday at 6:30 here, same channel, same place, that we can go into some of these matters deeper. We are following closely what's happening in America, and it is predictably tragic, is the way one thing to say about it. And that we are having a meeting tomorrow night at a Zoom meeting that you can go to. If you're on our e-list, you got an invitation to it. And that this will be an opportunity for us to talk about what it is that we can practically do given a time of COVID and rage and problems. So Dr. Shaw, Lewis Pitts, Dr. Green, anything final?
All I'll say is I'm again glad folks have come out this evening. This was a very informative class. And once you leave from our class this evening, I think for the sake of your sanity, you may not want to look at the news at the moment because...
Yeah, I see your face, Dr. Green.
It's pretty bad right now,
Yeah.
Even worse than it was just a few hours ago. But I think the events of the last few days have made it quite clear why things like the Modjeska School do matter. And I hope if you have time tomorrow, you can join us tomorrow night as well. But certainly we are living in some incredibly perilous times.
Right.
And as a historian, all I can say is I have absolutely no idea of what's coming next. Mm-hmm. But please keep the faith.
Got to.
Good night. Good night, all.
All right. Thank you now. Good night.
Stay safe and come back.
Yes.
Stay strong, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
Marjorie, how come there's two of you?